All right, welcome back. This is the Something About Your podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Andy McLoughlin. How are you doing?
I am pretty good, thank you, Ken. Yeah, I can't complain. It stopped raining, so life immediately seems better.
Thank you so much for doing this. This is great. You got a British accent, so I don't even have to work very hard. You're just going to sound smart. This is fantastic.
Why do you think I live in this country? It kind of like immediately gives me like 10 IQ points versus where I actually am.
It's great. You're kind of one of my, the Mandela effect thing where everybody thinks like, everybody swears Nelson Mandela died in jail in the 80s, but he didn't. He lived like into the 2000s. I swore I had you on my podcast before. I was like, I must have had Andy. I did that with Orrin Hoffman too, when I had him on. I'm like, I just thought I had you on, and I didn't.
Maybe like some kind of COVID fever dream where you just imagined it.
It was something like that. But in any case, Andy is a venture capitalist, but don't worry, it's going to be interesting. He is a founder who started a company and went through that whole experience. Invested as an angel very successfully, and now is the managing director of Uncork Capital, which started life as SoftTech. And I'm going to start there for a second. We'll get to you, but the founder of SoftTech is kind of a legend in Silicon Valley seed investing, right? It's a guy named Jeff Clavier, who's French. And before, I'm just trying to take people back to the time before everybody had a seed fund and, every person who worked at Facebook had one on the side. It wasn't a really obvious idea for somebody to go out and invest in startups. And somehow Jeff figured this out, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think when you kind of rewind back to that moment in time, there were a handful, I'd say maybe 10 of these folks who kind of got termed super angels, who were investing like angels, but often with small funds. I mean, these days you would call them solo GPs or micro funds. But it was pretty novel back then because the kind of perceived wisdom was that unless you had the capital to not only lead around, but kind of be able to follow on, you were going to be irrelevant. And I think what people like Jeff and Josh Koppelman and Chris from lowercase
Chris Sacca. Chris Sacca. Chris Sacca.
Chris Sacca, yeah, of course, yeah, brain fart. And Iden and and Mike Maples and others. What they realized was there actually was a market for folks who would invest super early, scarily early, often as a combined unit. So back then, seed investing was deeply collaborative. These 500 or 600K rounds would come together with people writing 100K checks each. And what that meant was like this crop of early investors all got into great deals because they were all investing together. And of course, what happened was some of them, like Steve from Baseline, kind of made enough money that they quit. And some kind of, their things became real franchises. I think Felice's is probably a great example of that, where they went, Aiden went from being a super angel to being, a manager of a very, very large set of funds and, building a real kind of team around him. But yeah, it's, we're kind of going way back into the history books here now, but there was a TechCrunch expose in probably, 2010, 2012 around the, kind of potential price collusion, these angels kind of working together. I don't think anything ever came of it, but it was just happier, simpler times in many ways.
Yeah, it's like kind of described as this magical time where if there was a deal, you kind of knew about it and you were kind of one of 5 guys. I don't know. I look back because I'm building a fund now too. And it's, there's not 10 guys, there's like 10,000 guys.
Right. Exactly.
It's like kind of not the same. And Jeff, I mean, man, such interesting investments, but he's told the story about how he almost did the Uber thing that would have made that fund, and missed it by like a day, or I forget how he tells the story. But
yeah, there's a bunch. I think some of them. I think like every great investor, you've got to have a bunch of stuff you missed, right? Yeah. For good reasons and bad reasons. And I think some of them, like Dropbox and Uber, and Airbnb, he has legitimately good reasons for having not gotten there. I think the one that still stings today, because I think he realizes that this was like a fuck up of epic proportions, was Twilio, where he and Jeff Lawson had known each other for a long time. The round had coalesced. It was coming together. Jeff had a 250K allocation in it, and it was being done at like a 4.5 or 5 mil pre-money valuation, which is, just laughably cheap in today's market.
Right.
But at the time, Jeff's like, I really don't do anything over 3, maybe 3.5.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeff Wilson's like, well, that's great, but like, this is the deal. This is what everybody else is doing. And Jeff's like, yeah, you know what? I'm out.
Yeah.
And so, of course, for quibbling over what is ultimately a rounding error, missing out on, what would have been something that could have returned that fund, 10x
Yeah.
plus over.
Yeah, it's a weird piece of venture math. Mark Andreessen talks about it, where he's like, look, the difference between like expensive and not expensive, I don't know, if it's a $10 million valuation versus $25 million is 2x. Like, it's a big difference. But the difference between something not succeeding and succeeding, like Twilio, is like 5,000x. And so it's really just being in the thing. And Uber's a funny one too. My partner Jonathan was an active angel investor at the time, and had rented space to Travis, knew him very well, and didn't invest in that one. And if you look back, you kind of think, well, at the time it was a black car service, right? Which, cool for Silicon Valley, but not very
Travis
big.
wasn't even running it.
That's the big one. And even today, if a founder came to us with some crazy idea and said, but I'm not going to be running this, I'm going to go on, X and look for a CEO. No way you do it today.
Yeah, it's what's interesting is I moved to the US in the middle of 2010. I think late May, early June, and I had a few other British friends that had moved out here before me, so I kind of had a bit of a network. And they'd been here for a year or two. They'd met interesting people, and me and a guy called Paul Carr, who you might remember. Paul was an active journalist at the time. He was writing for TechCrunch and others. Paul and I decided to hold a 4th of July party at my new apartment building in Soma. And the joke was it was a very British 4th of July party, so we called it a Dependence Day party. And it was a BYOB, which was Bring Your Own Brit, or kind of other newcomer to the city. And so we had a bunch of people there, including this guy I got talking to who was telling me he'd just moved to the city from Chicago with his wife. And he, crazy story, he had literally responded to a tweet about running a company, and it's like, and so now I'm the CEO of this thing called Uber Cab. I'm like, oh, that's cool. What does it do? And it's like, look, you can get on my phone here. You can see a black car. I can tell it that I want to go from here to say North Beach. I was like, all right, that's interesting. Out of interest, how much would that cost me? He's like, that'd be like $60. I'm like, that sounds fucking stupid, man. Good luck with that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you've got it, it's that thing, right? Facebook, I don't know, college, there's not that many people in college. It's a market of 4 million people, except, if the person can make the leap, it's kind of crazy. And by the way, who did, First Round did that, right?
They did. So First Round put money in, Founder Collective put money in. I think it was reasonably small checks for both of them. But, when the business is ultimately IPOing at almost $100 billion valuation.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Days.
You know who else put money? I had her on the podcast, is Cyan Bannister.
Nice.
Was an early investor in it. It's just one of those crazy stories where she had a car service, like a regular car service that would take her to the airport. And the guy who in the car was like, hey, do you know what Uber is? Because he's like, I have this schedule where, I pick someone up at 11 at the airport and 2 p.m. and I've gotten 2 hours in the middle. But there's this thing called Uber Cab or whatever. And I'm making a ton of money because in my downtime, I do 2 or 3 rides. And she's like, what? Like, you're making a living on something I've known. She went and met Travis and loved him, and I think invested like $250,000 in it.
And the rest is history. And now she's a gajillionaire.
She is, like she says, if I had a nickel for every time someone said I was wrong, and she's like, and I do. It's pretty good. So your entrepreneurial career was in England, right? You founded
So we, my buddy, a guy called Alistair Mitchell, and I co-founded a company called Huddle in 2007. Huddle was a early kind of online collaboration player. So kind of like next gen SharePoint, kind of, these days, you've got Box, of course, but Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, Dropbox are all kind of playing in this space. But back then it was still super nascent. And what was kind of interesting was that in London in 2007, you could probably count on one hand the number of enterprise software startups there were. You could probably count on 2 or 3 fingers.
Yeah.
And the London had a very kind of active startup scene, but it was still very much focused on consumer, a lot of e-commerce, lots of gaming was coming from that part of the world, but there really wasn't a ton of enterprise software. So we went into it basically not knowing anything about what we were doing. The lean startup hadn't been published. AWS had not launched. We were racking our own servers in London Docklands and doing capacity planning when we brought a customer on board in terms of what we would need in terms of new blades and firewalls, etc. We had to effectively write our own version of Stripe from scratch because nothing existed. And all of this kind of dates me and makes me sound like a terrible curmudgeon when I say to entrepreneurs these days that, you have no idea how good you have it. But we'd raised our Series A in the UK. We did our Series B with Matrix Partners out here. I moved out to the US in 2010 for what I thought was going to be a year or two. My plan had been, come out here, recruit the team to lead the US office, go back and continue running product in London. And of course, you blink and you've lived here for 16 years and you're a citizen, you're married, and you've got kids, and you're now a VC, and life is very different.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And how did you decide? So Huddle, like, how does it end? I mean, it gets acquired, goes public, or
gets acquired? Yeah. So we were acquired by a private equity firm in 2016. The P firm then sold the asset onto a public company in, I think, 2018 or 2019. And the product is still live today, which is interesting. It's been kind of wrapped up a couple of times since then, but I actually think there are still people who I hired in the UK way back when who are still there and working on it, which is kind of interesting.
Wow, it's pretty great. It's like that guy at Apple. You seen that guy? There's like a guy who's been there for he joined when he was like 17 or something.
Oh yeah, I know exactly who you mean.
He's been there forever. It's probably did pretty well. And so you invest at the same time as you're doing Huddle, or how did you become get at all good at being a seed investor?
Completely by accident. And I think that's true of a lot of people who angel invested. I think some people are very, very thoughtful and very meaningful about how they go around it. Many of us, though, it just kind of happened because you were chatting with somebody and they said that they were raising a bit of money. And what had happened was I'd been living here for probably 6 or 7 months or so. I had this apartment in Somo where we ran the Dependence Day party. It had a spare room. A friend of mine from London, a German guy, but had been living in the UK for many years, had moved out, and he was dead set on doing a startup. The idea that he kind of talked to me about was something called, it was a social media curation platform. How could you bundle up a bunch of tweets and YouTube videos and WordPress blogs and whatever else and kind of package and present that as a single entity? And I'm saying, I kind of think this idea stinks. Like, I don't think the world needs this, but you're awesome. And so the initial conversation started out with me kind of lending him some money so he could incorporate the business. Comes back to the apartment a couple of days later with a convertible note document. And he says, if you sign this, you'll become an investor in my business, curated.by. Surprise, surprise, that thing didn't work out, right? Yeah. The world, turns out, did not need this thing. But after a couple of twists and turns, this business turned into Postmates.
Yeah.
And so actually in the early years of the company, it was still called curated.by Inc. before it was legally renamed to Postmates. And that kind of just put me on the path where I realized I loved working with founders. At that point, we were probably, my business was probably, 100, 150, 200 people. It was becoming relatively mechanical, especially in my role. Just getting to spend time with these awesome people who were super early and helping them go from 0 to 1 became the favorite part of my day. And I remember with Basti, so, he said to me, look, if the thing doesn't work out, I will repay you the 10K that you lent me because you helped me get started. As it turned out, it worked out fine. I think the initial convertible note that we signed was on a $1 million or $1.5 million cap. He raised $100K from people like me and Naval. I think Cyan might have come into that round as well. I think that delivered a 350x.
It's amazing
in the end, even with all the dilution along the way. Which is why I think, it even kind of with the crazy times we're living right now, where valuations are going crazy and premium assets are are worth it. In the back of my mind, there's always this like entry valuation matters.
Yeah.
Entry valuation absolutely matters when it comes to multiples.
Yeah. And you can think, by the way, that's such a hard investment to make. It might have been the Sequoia guys who were talking about passing on Cursor, where which now is like a AI coding thing that's worth like maybe $60 billion or something like that today. And like their first round was at $5 or $6 million post money valuation or something like that. And I think it was the Sequoia guys that said, yeah, we really liked them, but whatever idea they had at the time, they hated.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing where you're like, I don't know about this curation thing. And then it's just one pivot from that black car to that thing, and you're like kicking yourself for the next 20 years.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think Hunter Walk has a great saying about this, which is, investing in people you love, building companies you don't hate. Now, maybe the Sequoia guys hated what the Cursor team were building so much they said no. But, at those kind of valuations, I feel like you can take a flyer. And I think especially doing it as an angel, you're an LP of one. The only person you've got to answer to if you screw up is yourself. And so you can afford to make those bets. And so I ultimately, invested into probably 35 or 36 companies, mainly European entrepreneurs who were moving out here. That was kind of the edge and the advantage I had. I'd been living here for, a year or two, three at that point. I could help them with lawyers. I could help them with VCs. I could help them with getting set up in the city. Because, there weren't that many Brits and Europeans who were out here and actively angel investing at the time. And that meant, I was one of the first checks into Intercom. I was the very first check into Pipedrive. That was a $1.5 billion acquisition by Vista back in 2021. First money into Calm, and a bunch of others that could still do something. So I think naivete and access and a lot of good fortune meant that I turned that kind of initial bit of cash that I'd basically done as secondary for my own business. I was living by myself in this cheap apartment in Soma, and so I didn't have much to spend it on. I ultimately kind of 15 or 16x'd that.
That's pretty good. That's a whole career right there. It's funny. It seems people coming over from Europe. Seems like every European company we invest in, the founder comes here. We just invested in a woman in Paris. Strangely, not the first woman in Paris we've invested in, but she promptly moved here to start her company. Is there any percentage in not moving here if you're a European company? Is it just too much to start something there?
I think it depends on how far along they are when you meet them. And I think it also depends on what they're trying to build. I mean, a pretty common pattern that we're seeing now is kind of what I think of as being the Israeli model is you'll keep engineering, research, whatever, back in the home country because you have access to talent. It's significantly cheaper than here. People stick around for longer. It's a little bit less mercenary. But then the CEO comes out here to build the go-to-market function because this is where the expertise is in that area. So we've got European founders who are 100% kind of picking up and building the business here. Zendesk is a great example of a business that did that well really, really early. But we're also seeing a lot of companies who are keeping core research. They're taking people out of DeepMind. There's researchers coming out of great universities in the UK and keeping that team there, which is much more the kind of the whiz Israeli model for how you build businesses. And I think this just goes like there's no one magic recipe that works for everybody. It's kind of what's the right thing for your team and the technology you're building and the market that you're serving.
Yeah. Well, until you get lucky and then you make up a story, right?
Doesn't
everybody, like every VC's got this whole thing, then they're the first investor in something that goes huge. And then there's a whole story about how they knew it all along.
Of course. I mean, that same investor that was also the one who will post on X the day that like a company has a huge outcome, their pass email. Yeah. I'm like, oh, come on. Don't make this about you.
Exactly. So at what point do you think to yourself, I could do this full time and professionally?
So I'd gotten to know Charles Hudson socially kind of when I first moved here. Charles ultimately became a good friend, remains a good friend now. And he would doing his job well take me out for beers. I was a poor entrepreneur, and he would take me out for beers and pizza and talk about the stuff that I was investing in and what I was seeing. And and I would then introduce the founders to him. And I think it was a combination of that plus the fact that Jeff had invested in Postmates about a year and a half after I first invested. I was kind of in their orbit. And, as we raised our Series D at Huddle, my mind kind of turned to like, it's kind of getting into this mode now, which I'm just not really enjoying. I'm a big believer in kind of, knowing what your strengths are and kind of what you love. I don't know if you remember in the Matrix movie when he's at the Oracle's house, there's a cross-stitch thing above the door that says in Latin, know thyself.
Yeah.
And I think that, knowing yourself and knowing kind of, what you want to do and what you're great at is one of the most powerful things anybody can do. Because if you can find yourself working at the intersection of what you love and what you're good at, that's when the magic happens. That's when, it doesn't feel like work anymore. That's when you're still kind of at the kitchen table at like 11 p.m. with your wife saying, "Are you going to finish anytime soon?" You're like, "Not yet. One more thing.
Yeah.
This happened last night."
Yeah. Right. It's kind of oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say what I'd realized was that my heart wasn't in the building of the business anymore. That was much more my co-founder's forte. I loved I love this, working with founders. I love, helping them out. I love finding deals and, doing the work on it. And Charles for a little while had been kind of in my ears. Like, have you thought about doing this as a full-time job? And I was always like, well, I've got a lot that I need to do at work. And then at some point it's like, what, I could step away at this point and it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I remember chatting with Ross Simmons, who was one of the co-founders of Yelp, and he had this great phrase about it, where, when he stepped away, he realized that he was throwing these beautifully made, highly polished spanners into the machine. And I kind of felt like the same thing. I was doing great work, but I was kind of getting in the way. Now, I'm not sure ultimately how true that was. I think, when a founder steps away, it does leave a big hole because you realize there's a bunch of stuff that you have this crazy kind of muscle memory and organizational knowledge that is kind of hard to fill. But ultimately, you need to kind of find the people that can excel in the particular roles that you were doing. And, you may need to hire 3 or 4 people, but they will individually be better than you were. And so I said to Charles, I'm kind of ready to have that conversation now. So I went and had lunch with Jeff one day, and he was looking, I know he was talking to a bunch of people. And I guess it was interesting enough to him. I went back the next month, and then the next month after that, and then 2 weeks after that, and then every week. And, we were kind of dating. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. And he, I guess he talked to a bunch of the founders I'd invested in and, my VCs and other people. And he calls me one day. He's like, "I'd like you to come and work with us. I'd like you to be I think he called it the SaaS guy at SoftTech VC, which was the name of the fund back then." And that was, I think we talked in maybe actually late 2014. And I was like, well, that's amazing. Obviously, I need to talk to my board about this, but, consider me extremely interested. And I'd had this grand plan. Like, I'd been kind of going at this full time, from consulting into starting this business, not paying myself very much, like no vacations for like what felt like forever. And I'd had this grand plan that all the stuff that I'd never had time to do, learn to scuba dive, walk Machu Picchu, all the cool things that you get jealous when your friends with real jobs can do. Go and do those. And of course, what happened was the board said, "That's great, Andy. We're happy for you. We think we're totally okay with you stepping away, but we need you to do these things." And Clavier is like, "Well, that's great, Andy, but I need you to start ASAP because we've got like a bunch of stuff in pipeline." And so this kind of grand plan I had for 6 months of adventure and healing and time got compressed into to the point where I finished at Huddle on Friday, April the 3rd of 2015. And I started at SoftTech on Monday, April the 6th. And I had the flu at the time as well.
Yeah. You'll get to that grand plan later.
One day.
Another 16 years. It's funny you say that about the, like kind of what you're, what you're good at, or if you mean the point of the company that you're good at. Somebody said, and it stuck with me, this idea that that the company changes every 3 acts, meaning like there's 3 people and that's something. You're sitting in your garage, and then there's 9 people and that's a little something else. Okay, 27 people. You probably, maybe not everybody's reporting to you anymore. Okay, I'm not really good at math, but whatever. 100 people. Okay, now there's an HR person and a lawyer. Like that kind of, that kind of stuck with me. And I feel, at least for me, like you get to that 100, 300 person thing, it's just a difference.
It is. And I think, some people really excel at that.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's just not for me. I remember when I joined, somebody had said to me, like, if that genuinely is you, then venture is actually an amazing job because it's one of the few jobs where you can be deeply successful without having to manage a bunch of people. You can still be kind of an IC. Maybe you get that as being like a distinguished engineer at Google. Maybe you get that by being kind of a distinguished scientist at OpenAI now. But, if you don't want to manage people but like make money, venture is still a really good way to do it if you do it well.
Yeah, and I think that the flip side is it's the same job all the time. Like it doesn't, when you're in a company, it's one thing. There's 3 people, and then there's 100 people, and you're growing, and your revenue that used to be 2 million is now 200 million. In venture, you kind of, day one, you raise money from LPs, and you meet founders, and you help them out, and day 1,000, you raise money from LPs.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly kind of is a bit of a sausage factory where stuff is just going through, and you are doing the inspection and, putting the ingredients in and hoping that it gets well cooked on the way out and doesn't explode. I do think, though, that, I've been able to scratch my kind of entrepreneurial itch, because I do get asked, would you ever go back to operating? And, when I see the founders that we work with who are just like supremely awesome operating, like I'm not like that. I'm not as good as them. But I think what I am good at is like insane context switching and being able to do a bunch of stuff at any one time. But the entrepreneurial itch is there. And I think now, having been able to take over the management of the firm and, working with Jeff, but kind of really building it into kind of what I want Uncork to be, in terms of, the types of deals that we're doing, the people that we're hiring, the shape of the firm going forward, because, it's not, we have no ambitions to ever be the size of Andreessen Horowitz, but when I joined, we were 4 or 5 people, and I think very soon we're going to be 16 or 17.
Yeah.
And that's kind of cool. We're building a real thing here.
And how do you contrast that, or maybe you've just answered this, is, Charles Hudson went a direction of, I'm going to start my own thing. I'm going to raise money. I'm going to, clean sheet of paper and have my own idea about how to invest. Whereas you joined something that was working pretty well, and you made it work better and bigger. Like, how do you contrast those things? Like, why didn't you go start your own thing?
Totally. I mean, and this is something that, Jeff actually asked me this exact question, as we were kind of sitting down for lunch one day. He's like, mate, why don't you go and do your own thing? You could probably go and raise $20 or $30 million, do the thing where you're helping European founders come over here and raise money. And my honest answer was that, I'd fallen into entrepreneurship by accident, and we screwed up a bunch of stuff along the way. Like, laughable mistakes now in retrospect. And, I feel like I had the potential to be really good at this, but I would only be really good if I got to learn from somebody who had made those mistakes themselves. Charles had been in the world of venture for many years. He'd been at Incutel and SoftTech, so he'd seen it, right? He'd built that mental model. I didn't want to go and do my own thing and kind of fuck up in the same way as I screwed up a bunch of the stuff that I did as an entrepreneur.
Yeah. So a couple of things about just kind of your musings on Silicon Valley. Oh, well, first of all, I wanted to ask you, you at some point did, I don't know if you're still doing it, instituted this idea of the founder's pledge, like once you make money, putting some money back into something or other. How'd you come to hit that path?
Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of idea with the founder's pledge, it happened actually at a conference following a web summit in New York, where I was in a room full of founders, many of whom were early stage like myself, many of whom were sitting on, potentially huge amounts of money in the future, but it was all on paper. And I was chatting with Scott Harrison, who runs Charity Water, and we were talking about this notion of like, wouldn't it be great if people could kind of pledge future earnings, future wealth to a charity, or at least kind of a pot of charities that they can feel good about. They can the charities kind of know that they're being appreciated, and at some point this will come good. Because you talk to a lot of people who are very early in their careers, and they want to make a difference. There's something that's important to them that they want to help. They just don't have the means to do it, and so this was kind of a way to systemize that. As it happened, there was a guy in London working with Brent Hoberman at Founders Forum, who was having the exact same idea. And so, by luck, we got connected. Name is David Goldberg. David was the CEO of the Founders Pledge for many years, and actually just stepped back in the last 6 months or so. Charlotte Monaco is running it now. And, David, for him, this was his thing. I had an idea. He had a similar idea. I had the network out here. He had the drive and the smarts to go and do it. And under his leadership, we turned this from basically him and I running around tech conferences with a piece of paper where he'd make people sign a pledge on my back to a team of like 20 or 30 or even 40 people now who are researching the highest leverage charities in any space. They're running a DAF system, now hundreds and hundreds of pledges, in aggregate, billions and billions of dollars, many hundreds of millions, which have already been deployed to charities.
That's
So,
amazing.
David very kindly allows me to call myself a co-founder of this, even though I haven't really done all that much other than allow him to sign papers on my back and make a bunch of introductions in the early days. I sat on the board of trustees for many years as well.
That's great. All right, well, a little fun with Silicon Valley. The current, so if you were to believe a VC Twitter, seed funds like yours are dead. They should no longer exist. And the logic goes, there's these big funds that have raised enormous amounts of capital. True, can confirm. And these funds are so big that they are now doing all the good deals and putting so much money into the good deals that nobody like you could possibly compete with that. Did I get that right? Is that the current?
Sure. Why not? Why not? And I'm going to quote Mark Twain back at you, which is the rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated.
Exactly.
Look, I mean, we're living in a world today where, these mega funds can effectively snap their fingers and raise billions of dollars from LPs that frankly don't care about venture scale returns. If you're raising, $2 billion from the PIF and you ultimately give them back $3 billion, they're going to be pretty happy with that. You give, your average LP 1.5x their money back, and then, they're going to be very unhappy. So there's been a bifurcation not only of the GP sizes and the fund size, but also kind of where the LPs are putting dollars. And more we're hearing from kind of a lot of the traditional LPs that they are getting, pretty disenfranchised with these mega funds because just the returns just don't stack up for them. If you can write a $2 billion check, then it's great. But if you're writing a $20 million check and you're getting 30 back, not that exciting. And so what we've seen is that there's definitely kind of a flight to quality at both ends. I think there's the, investing in GC or Andreessen now is kind of the equivalent if you don't get fired for buying IBM. Right. But like a lot of the more thoughtful and sophisticated LPs are kind of looking earlier in the stack for where they can still find alpha. A byproduct of kind of all this money sloshing around with the mega funds, though, is that we're kind of living through this age of consensus investing, where as soon as something appears to be obvious or consensus, they will come in and they will oftentimes just write an option check. They're going to write a $5 or $6 million check to lead a $10 million seed round. And if it works, then great. And if it doesn't, what does it matter? Because that's, a teeny tiny fraction of what they're doing. I think there are a whole universe of founders that get starry-eyed about having one of these big name firms, and that's what they want. And, that's completely fine. There's also a lot of founders, often folks who have been through this before, who realize that, the brand of the firm that most people would recognize is actually not often the best for founders at the early stages. What they're looking for is somebody who specializes there. And I think the other thing is, our job is to find businesses which, we have conviction will become consensus, but don't appear obvious yet. Because like I said, as soon as something appears obvious, one of the big name brands is going to come in and do something that we just think is economically stupid. Yeah. But it works for them. So it's all about finding these unpolished diamonds where you, through knowing the founders or by having, some kind of insight into the space, are prepared to make a gamble that you can take this thing that doesn't appear all that exciting to the outside world today, and within 18 to 24 months or less, make it look like a consensus deal.
Yeah. And that, of course, seems to be the joke to me, is when everyone says, it's right there in the first sentence, like they get all the good deals. And it's like, well, of course you don't know what the good deal is. Like that's the whole point, is that you invest in Travis when it's a black car service, or Mark Zuckerberg when it's a college thing, or, whatever the case may be. I also get the sense too that the partners at those big firms, maybe not the associates, but the partners don't really want to do seed investing. They want you to bring something that's ready to take their $20 to $50 million check.
Well, exactly. But I think what they also are very happy with is the junior investors to go and do those deals. So it gives them a chance to stay on top of them. I think, to any founder, I'm kind of, I'm talking my own book here, but, working with somebody who does this full time, somebody who is a GP in a firm, somebody who is going to be around 5 years from now when things invariably don't go to plan because these are startups, right? Shit's really hard. Stuff goes wrong. That versus, taking money from a big name brand where you're working with a junior investor that probably isn't going to be there in 3 years' time. It depends on what the founder is optimizing for. And if they're optimizing for that big brand up front, then that's great. Good luck to them. But if they're not, then there's a wealth of great firms that they can go and spend time with.
And the very tactical problem that a lot of founders seem to understand when you explain it is if somebody does that, if a big firm with a great name, famous, huge firm, multi-billion-dollar firm puts $2 million into your thing, you don't really matter to them at that point. But when you go to raise your next round, the question that you're going to get is, well, they're going to lead this round, right? And if they don't, for whatever reason, you're good, you're bad, they just don't feel like it on that day, then you have a problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can work well when, say, I'm just going to pick on some random names here. Andreessen does your seed round and the company is absolutely ripping, and then Sequoia comes in and does the Series A. No one's going to ask why Andreessen didn't do the Series A. I think it's when, things are going okay, but not great, and Andreessen don't step up to do the A, then it just leads to a bunch of difficult questions. You just look like looking like bruised fruit.
Yeah. So what do you make of Silicon Valley? This is a little fun with Silicon Valley. What do you make of Silicon Valley in the past few years? Everybody, it's just been fun to watch, and I'm on the sidelines just watching, but a bunch of venture guys suddenly getting sort of political and starting to yell at each other and seeming to have a lot of fun, like Mark Andreessen and David Sachs, and there's Sean McGuire over at Sequoia. Are they're just rich guys having fun because nothing affects them, or what? Like it just seems like a vibe shift in the last few years.
I mean, look, it makes a great entertainment for the rest of us.
So good.
I mean, I don't know how active any of these people are in terms of new deals anymore. So, they've got to fill their time in some way. I do think that there was, for a moment in time, a sense that, by being active like this, especially if you had a particular political view, it could get you closer to the government. That could kind of lead to good things. I think David Sachs has played that pretty well. But I think for the vast majority of us, where we're not wealthy enough to stop working and just pontificate on Twitter, it's just kind of noise in the background.
That's true. I think there is, and maybe you don't agree, but I do think there's more a practical version of it, which is somebody like Gary Tan, who's, as I don't put words in his mouth, but is looking around and saying, hey, there's things that are happening in politics that could hurt us, like hurt the ecosystem that we're trying to build, like asset taxes coming to Silicon Valley, such that people like Larry or Sergey, David Sachs, or founders thinking of coming to Silicon Valley don't do it.
I think that that is absolutely a worthwhile concern and something that people should be worried about. I mean, this is kind of for many years the role of the NBCA to be in Washington lobbying on behalf of the industry. But I think it's also great that people who have a megaphone and who have people listening to them are speaking up about this stuff. The Silicon Valley kind of happened through an accident, right? An accident of time and proximity and talent and a couple of other things. And it's very, very hard to replicate. But it is kind of amusing to me that politicians will basically do unnatural things in order to unwind that for no good reason other than to tax the wealthy. And I'm a big believer, wealthy people should be taxed, but not to the point where they end up leaving the state and the state is ultimately poorer.
Yeah. I did a whole podcast on this recently where I researched it. And it turns out that the wealthy people, they may not be paying enough tax, and you argue about that, but they are paying a lot of tax. And it turns out that the top 1% in California pay like 40%, and the top 10% pay 70%. So even though it's a low proportion, and Warren Buffett says, well, I have a lower tax rate than my executive assistant. If Larry's living in California, his stocks are paying dividends. When SpaceX goes public, he's recording that on his tax return and paying the taxes on that. And so just the scale of their wealth is such that even the smaller pieces of taxes that fall off of it are huge. And when these guys leave, I mean, nothing's happened yet. And these guys are in Florida and Texas. It's kind of a crazy. When I was working in Silicon Valley 15 years ago, I didn't even know who my district supervisor was. Like in San Francisco, like it just didn't even occurred to me. Like these guys are just making the toilets flush and the electricity, and I don't know what they do. It's fine. And now you're at a point where you've got pretty serious Silicon Valley people saying, this may be a thing that destroys Silicon Valley, which is
yeah. And I think, and when you zoom in even further, you've got people looking at what's going on in San Francisco. I think the city was in real trouble for a really long time, right? Things were not good.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us who stayed, myself and yourself included, to kind of feel good about our decision. A lot of people left. A lot of them have then quite quietly come back.
Yeah.
But a big part of why things are working now is obviously, again, luck and timing. AI happened here, and now everybody feels like they need to be here. But that's kind of coupled with a change in administration, especially on the board of supervisors, where you now have a bunch of people who are pro-business and pro-safety and pro-housing.
Yeah.
And, versus, kind of wanting to keep San Francisco in this kind of rose-tinted kind of fake version of kind of what it was when they first moved here 25 years ago. I mean, it blows my mind that the progressives, and this is such a hilarious name, that the progressives have gone all the way around the political spectrum, where they've basically become extremely conservative about house building and other things.
It's crazy. I recently went to see a show at the Castro Theater. So there's a beautiful theater in San Francisco in the Castro district, which is famous for, the gay rights movement sort of came out. Beautiful theater, but it was shut down in disrepair. The seats were these terrible old seats, and somebody came in to redo it. And our board of supervisors fought renovating an empty theater for reasons. It's beautiful. Like
it's incredible. We went to see Sam Smith there during his residency, and it's unreal. It's like small, it's intimate. The sound system is unbelievable. It's beautiful inside. And it just makes no sense that people would push back on something like that. And I'm sure they had reasons that they thought were good and valid. But again, there's no progress with these progressives.
Yeah. Well, I think that maybe what's happened in Silicon Valley, putting aside the kind of, Keith Roboy, David Sachs stuff, but I think people in Silicon Valley were just kind of doing their thing, and the politicians were taking the money and going to the meeting on Tuesday afternoon at 2 and putting together a plan to do some thing that if anybody told you what they were doing, you'd be like, wait, that's insane. But you just weren't paying attention. And then all of a sudden it just got so bad in San Francisco that people were like, we got to pay attention. Like, we're paying for all this stuff and all these things are happening. We just have no voice in it, and we're being vilified for it. We're literally not doing anything but giving you money, and we're being vilified for it. So if we're gonna be vilified, maybe we should just get in there and make something happen.
Yeah. I mean, I put a lot of credit here, kind of at the door of GrowSF. I'm sure you're familiar with them. This is basically a couple of former tech guys. In fact, Sachin was Gary Tan's co-founder at Posterous. And they cared about the city. They understood kind of where the issues were, and they're like, we can fix a lot of this through information. Let people know what's going on. Give them the information to make rational choices at election time. Because everybody in the city gets a big thick book with election materials. Nobody reads it other than my wife, because she's crazy. But I don't think anybody else in the city reads the thing, because it's absolutely massive and super dense and not very interesting. And even when you read it, you still don't really get kind of what people stand for. And so
because everything's called money for a better tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Which is probably actually an anti-housing lobby or something.
Right. Or it's a water bond or something like that. It's crazy. So let's just a couple final things here. What is there sort of I don't want to say mafia, but like a British crew in Silicon Valley? There's certainly a Canadian thing here. Is there a British?
Absolutely. Yeah, when I first moved here, there were a bunch of Brits here. I mean, there's always been thousands and thousands of Brits across the Bay Area, from down in Sunnyvale all the way up to Marin. But there was no real organization. And so a group of us back probably about 10 years ago decided to start something called GBX, kind of like based on the Canadian C100, a network of people who are here because, we all want to get to know each other. We all live here for reasons, and we love it here, but having a connection to the old country is great as well. But more importantly, providing a landing pad for the people who are moving out. And, in the early days, it was me, Pete Flint, who's now at NFX,
Yeah.
Michael Birch, who was the owner of Bebo, that now owns the battery. We had my co-founder, Alistair Mitchell, his wife, Kate, was our exec director. So she was running the thing. Julian Green, who's kind of Google X, just a lot of like really awesome people. And, it was just an idea at that point. Today, 500 or 600 members, most of them here, a bunch in the UK though, events all throughout the year. And, we've really been able to kind of systemize this landing pad for founders who are coming out to give them access to a network of new friends, but also kind of the connectivity that we've all built from having been here for so many years.
Yeah. Your guy, Harry Stebbings over there has done pretty well.
Yeah. I mean, and I think Harry, has, he's now, one of the voices in Europe. I mean, I don't think he spends a lot of time out here. But, people will, if he invests in a company, people will take it seriously.
Yeah. That's a crazy story. Kind of an N of one too. Like it seems like I've been doing this for a while and I do it because it entertains me, but, everybody seems to have a podcast, and that seems like the only one that, because you look at a guy like David Sachs, I mean, he was already, his podcast is great and it's really cool, but he was already famous, and people knew who Chamath was. Kind of final couple of things. How do you feel? If you kind of saw the emergence of the internet, the emergence of mobile, what do you think about investing in a world where AI has sort of entered the stage as you're investing in seed stage companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, everything that we're looking at is an AI company. Now, I think you can then kind of go a little bit deeper and be like, okay, so what is an AI company? Is it AI infrastructure? Is it built AI native? Are they running the business using AI? I think it's kind of all on the table. I also think that, in a handful of years, nobody's going to be talking about AI companies. They're just going to be businesses. Like no one talks about, I'm a cloud-based software company. It's just a given. I think part of it is, we live in this echo chamber where VCs are so focused and fixated on kind of what the next big thing is. You could have a perfectly good business, but if it doesn't feel AI native, nobody's going to be interested. So every founder feels like they need to have an AI story, even if it's been shoehorned in a little bit. But that said, the frontier models, Claude, OpenAI, they have just fundamentally changed the way that everything is being done. I think again, kind of on the echo chamber piece, we're all living this firsthand and we're kind of surrounded by it. You go and talk to somebody who's running a manufacturing company in the Midwest, they've heard about AI. Maybe they're using Microsoft Copilot, something kind of super crappy like that, but it hasn't touched them yet. So, we really are, even though it feels like people might be late to the game now, we are in the earliest of early innings when it comes to.
You're totally right. And it totally happens too with like, mobile comes along, right? And everyone's doing check-ins on Foursquare, and that's kind of cool. But then the imagination kicks in, and somebody like Travis and his partner, however that works, said, no, here's what you do with a mobile phone. You can identify where somebody is, and you can pay a driver, and that's what it is. And I bet in AI we haven't even seen that yet. If somebody goes, no, the guy's going to walk into your office in the next 6 months, or that woman's going to walk in your office and be like, here's what you do with AI, and you're going to go, okay, that sounds crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is we're kind of living in the era right now of when, I think we're at the back end of this, but kind of still in this kind of first innings where, if you remember when the App Store first launched and everybody could build an app, anybody that had a traditional piece of software was trying to jam every single piece of functionality into the mobile app. And, the ergonomics just didn't work. It wasn't built for that. It feels like we've seen a little bit of that right now where everything feels like it has to have AI all over it. And what we will figure out over the next year or two is kind of where are the ergonomics that you need it or you don't. I did see an interesting contrary opinion on X either this morning or last night about SaaSpocalypse and is that actually massively overstated? And their argument was that with vibe coding and the ability for anybody to create software, these systems of record actually become even more important, because when you've got 100 systems touching them, you can't just rip them out and kind of go from one thing to the other anymore.
Yeah, and I think people also forget too that code is code and businesses are businesses.
Yes.
And just because you can vibe code something on the weekend doesn't mean that the, Southern California healthcare system that's regulated by HIPAA and has 5,000 nurses that need the thing to work and they need to call you 24 hours a day is going to use your vibe coded thing. Like, I
Totally.
think you tend to hear it more from people, I think, who maybe haven't run businesses. One thing that's kind of surprised me is people who are like, I've met a few friends who are like anti-AI, which seems crazy. Like, I was just traveling in Europe and, I pull out the phone and, oh shit, there's 8 things on the wine list. And just take a picture and tells me what to get. Like, I can't figure out the thermostat. Tell me. I don't get it. But there's a few people running around who are like, nah, I don't like it. Which is weird. That you didn't really have that with mobile or the internet, I don't think.
I don't know. I think there were plenty of people that refused to get a smartphone for a long time.
I guess it's true.
There were plenty of people who, refused to buy into the internet because they could get everything they needed from their daily newspaper. You wind all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. They were the people who smashed the mills
Yeah.
and the looms because they felt like it was going to destroy humanity. So there's nothing new there. I mean, the
Yeah.
Luddites have appeared in every single technology cycle and will continue to in the future as well.
Yeah, wait till they see Waymos.
What they do, and I think it's these people that are kind of jumping on them and setting them on fire.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty. I mean, that has
I mean,
been
I
kind of
think there is there is actually a real concern here, and Waymo is probably like a particularly acute example of where this next technology cycle is going to be reducing the need for human labor. And right now, like, we still don't have a good answer to this. When the not just blue collar but white collar work, it could eat 50% plus of kind of what people are doing in the next few years, and in the long term much more. What happens to those people?
yeah,
Yes, they can be reskilled, yes, they can go into new jobs, but then what
yeah.
happens when that job gets automated?
It's true. I find myself. Well, I've always thought it was weird. I was an econ major. That unemployment numbers are like not 4% unemployment or 3%. Like, how is it that the number of jobs in the world is almost exactly the number of people? Like, why is it unemployment like 90% or we need 140%? Like, there's twice as many jobs as we need to do. But I always find myself quoting Mark Andreessen a lot, I guess. But there's the idea that his thesis is that tech wipes out jobs, but then creates that when jobs go up by 1 million, what really happened is we wiped out 10 million jobs and added 11 million. And the classic one is Uber, right? Like, oh, we knocked out that just created all these jobs. So the Uber job that's going away didn't exist 15 years ago. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
know.
yeah.
It seems like a problem we should solve when we actually have it, but
Yeah, I mean, the other alternative is we basically kind of end up in a world that's like Wall-E, the Disney movie, where we're all
yeah.
grossly overweight and kind of sitting in floating chairs, eating kind of liquidized cupcakes and having robot service.
I'm looking forward to it. Well, this has been great. What are you excited about? What are you looking forward to as you're building this building Uncork?
I mean, getting some distributions back would be amazing.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of things in play right now, which is, and so I think everybody that's in venture, more or less, have been a few outliers. Everybody's kind of been waiting for the liquidity cycle to start again. It feels like we're seeing signs of that, which is exciting. I mean, for me, being able to build the team, hire people like Susan and Trip and Amy, and kind of and allow them to do great work is like exceptionally motivating and satisfying. I think for me, my biggest concern is always like, how do I stay relevant? How do I stay on top of what's interesting? How do I ensure I'm seeing, the best deals that I can? And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's just a constant challenge, like, to just be as good as you can be at this.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So how do people find you and Uncork, a founder or somebody who's just interested in what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, look, we are very, very open to getting cold pitches. There was this kind of old thing in Silicon Valley where you had to have the warm intro, and that's great. If you can get a warm intro, that's really good. I mean, it often shows kind of resourcefulness, but if you can't, like, just drop us an email. Like, my email address is not hard to guess. If you can't guess it, then you probably shouldn't be starting a company.
That's Mark Andreessen says a version of that one too, where he's like, yeah, he claims that the reason that you need a warm intro is he's like, it's just the first test. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, and if you can get the warm intro, that's great. But I remember getting an email out of the blue in the middle of 2018 from this kid, and he's like, "Hey, Andy, I'm 18 years old. My two co-founders are the same age. This is our third company we've been working on together. We're building a next generation software development environment called Coda. We saw your investment in Launch Darkly and other dev tools. We think you'd be great. Here's a video. Let us know if you'd want to chat." And I was like, this is a remarkably good cold email. Like just hit the nail on the head. I led that round with Redpoint a few months, like probably a month and a half later. That company just raised, $90 million in their latest round. So, they're motoring.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'll wrap up. But Charles Hudson pointed out on this podcast, he's like, there's people, if you went to Stanford and, worked at Google, it's pretty easy to get to a VC. But you could be a smart guy who went to like Tennessee State and you just don't know, and you have a really good company, and you don't know people. And he pointed out that he was pretty open to getting those kind of cold emails because he's like, well, I understand why you can't find me. You're in a different network, basically. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
My pleasure, Ken.
All right. This has been the Something Venture podcast. Andy McLoughlin, my guest. Talk to you next time.